Hey everybody, welcome back to Better Computer. My name is Matt, and this is going to be a weird little video today, but I wanted to make it just for fun. This is not going to be a normal thing on the channel, but I thought this would be kind of fun to do. I'm going to rate all the iPhones on a tier list from S all the way down to D. I am going to rate some of these iPhones low, and you may disagree with me, and you may be like, well, these are way better than whatever Android phones were out there. I totally get that. Even the worst iPhone is pretty darn good, but they're compared to each other in this case. So just take this all with a grain of salt. It's just meant to be a little fun. So let's jump into ranking every single iPhone Apple's ever made. So we have to start with the original iPhone, and I'm just going to be straight with you. It goes right here at the top. It's an S tier phone. There were tons of issues with it. I totally get that. But if you look at this picture of the iPhone and compare it to what iPhones looked like for 10 years after, and if you look at the home screen and what the home screen looks like today on the iPhone, Apple nailed so much with this first one. You just have to respect it as the original for getting so many things right up front. It didn't have GPS. It had Edge, like 2G connectivity. It didn't even have 3G at the time, even though that was a thing. It didn't have a front-facing camera at all. It didn't do video. Lots of issues, but absolutely an innovator and iconic phone. Love, love, love this phone. It has to be an S tier. Then it was followed up by the 3G, which fixed some issues with the original iPhone, but isn't that remarkable in the grand scheme of things. I'm going to put this in a C tier, partially because it did make the iPhone better. It was objectively a better iPhone than the one that came before it, but in pretty much every case, every one of these is going to be better than the one that came before it. It's not one that stands out. No one's going to say the iPhone 3G was their favorite iPhone ever. Maybe someone will, but I really don't think it's going to be high up on that list. The 3GS I'm actually going to throw in the same tier list. Again, made some good improvements, especially in terms of performance, but kind of a forgetful iPhone in the grand scheme of things. Which brings us to not a forgetful iPhone. We have the iPhone 4, and this one goes, well, obviously it goes in the S tier. This has so many things going for it. This had more drama associated with it than any other iPhone I can remember. It leaked months ahead of time. Like the actual physical phone was left at a bar and was picked up, and we just saw everything. It added Retina. It added a front-facing camera for the first time. It had the iconic design of the glass and metal, and absolutely love it. This is an iconic phone. Absolutely, absolutely S tier on this one. Now, ironically, the second S phone in the line, the iPhone 4S, I'm going to put this in B tier. I think B tier is the right place for it. It inherits all the great things about the iPhone 4 and adds some performance, of course, had better cameras, and had Siri. So, you know what? Honestly, I'm going to move it up to A tier. I think this is a really, really good phone. It is kind of hard for me to complain that much about it. I think it has all those great features that people loved about the 4, but was faster, better camera, and added Siri, which we still use today, which, again, not a perfect thing, but that's where it kind of started happening on the iPhone. So I got to give it respect. I'll give it an A. Then we had the iPhone 5, and this might be a controversial opinion. Not super controversial, I hope, but I think the iPhone 5 is the best designed iPhone Apple's ever made. I actually like it more than the iPhone 4. I like how refined it is. I like the chamfered edges. I like how light it felt. If you don't remember that when that phone came out, it was so light. It felt like fake. It felt like a dummy unit almost. I'm going to give it A tier. I think the iPhone 5 was great. It was the first bigger screen iPhone. It was only 4 inches, but that was a half inch bigger than what we had before. I think that was a really nice phone from Apple. The 5C came out next year, so now we're into the first year that Apple introduced multiple iPhones in the same year. The iPhone 5C was literally the iPhone 5, but with a plastic body. It had fun colors, but it didn't sell very well, and it was kind of just not that exciting. I'm going to give it a C tier. The only reason it's not a D tier is because they really went for something new. The colors were bold, they were great. It just wasn't quite the right phone. So I'm going to give the iPhone 5C a C class. And then there was the iPhone 5S, which was the actual big flagship new iPhone that year. And then this one might surprise you. I'm giving it S tier. It has all the great things about the iPhone 5 design-wise, but it also has, again, more performance. It had a big camera update, if I remember correctly. And this is the thing that really pushes it into S tier for me, is it added Touch ID. So it was the first iPhone with biometrics. I didn't even mention with the iPhone 5 that added Lightning, which we're still using on iPhones, for better or for worse. But for the iPhone 5, very impressive that the port we introduced then is still being used in 2021. But back on the 5S, Yeah, introduced Touch ID, which added security to a lot of people's phones. It was really good compared to the competition at the time. I think the Samsung version of that had you like swipe your finger over the button to like make it recognize it. It was crazy. But yeah, the 5S, in my opinion, is an S tier phone. The best design, added Touch ID, just fantastic. Love this phone. Which brings us to the iPhone 6, which I'm maybe going to surprise you. I think this is a D tier phone. This is a super high-selling phone. Apple saw a massive uptick in sales and profits when they released this phone. People wanted a bigger screen iPhone, but in retrospect, this is an ugly phone. This phone looks so bad. It was slippery in the hand, like it just shot out of your hand, far more than iPhones do today. Like the aluminum back was just, and the curve sides, it was super, super thin. This had the bend gate issue, which again, kind of like antenna gate with the iPhone 4, which I didn't even mention. Wasn't as big a deal as some people thought it was, but also was actually an issue with the phone. Like my iPhone 6, when I was done with it, was actually a little curved, which is not ideal, and I treat my phones really well. So it had that issue. It just looks ugly, those antenna lines, especially on the gold one. If you remember what the gold one looked like with like white antenna lines, and the antenna lines were gummy like that, you could, absolutely did not like it. Which brings us to the 6S, which you might expect to also be D tier. I'm going to give it C tier, actually. The iPhone 6S I'm putting in the C tier because it added Force Touch. Force Touch? 3D Touch. 3D Touch is what they added to the iPhone 6S. And I know people didn't love it, but this is my list. And I really liked 3D Touch. I really wish that they were able to keep that going, but obviously it didn't land with everybody. It didn't warrant its space in the phone, so I get it. But personally, I really like that innovation, so I'm glad that it was there. That's the only thing that redeems this phone. Also, the 6S, and this I might want to pull it down to D tier even for this. The rose gold 6S, I think, is the worst looking iPhone Apple's ever made. I don't understand that one. I think combined with the antenna lines, just not good. Now, a couple of months after the iPhone 6S came out, we got the iPhone SE, which was the iPhone 5S shape, like design, but with the internals of the 6S. So I'm actually going to give this A tier. I think the SE is a really good phone. I think it had better specs at the time than we thought. Like there was a rumor of the smaller iPhone coming, but people thought it would have lower specs. We were surprised to see it had the same specs as the flagship, and it was just much cheaper. So really, really happy with the SE. People still use it. I've got one right here that I use just every once in a while, and it's just like, it's such a satisfying little phone to use. I've got the gold one. I really, really like this phone, so I'm giving it an A tier. You could probably argue it's maybe a B, but for me, on my list, it's A tier. I love this device. Then we have the iPhone 7, and 7 and 8 I'll kind of cover together because these are really... The 7, I'm going to give a D tier. It gets maybe some points for the dual camera system on the 7 Plus that came out that year, but that's really it. I think that it's a third year with the worst design that the iPhone's ever had. At this point, the design language was getting pretty out of date. It was getting pretty stale with like the big chunky bezels on the front. Like this was not the best iPhone. And again, it was the third year with a pretty bad design in my opinion. So not a fan of the 7 particularly. The 8, I'll give it a C tier. Nothing's really going in B tier yet, but the 8 I think is a C tier phone. The design was still very tired, but they did add wireless charging. They added glass to the back. The cameras were definitely improved. I think the battery was pretty darn good on these. I had the gold one. I really, really liked how the gold one looked. So it has a couple of redeeming things, but in the grand scheme of things, kind of like I said with the 3G and 3GS, no one's going to say this is their favorite iPhone. And it was kind of long in the tooth design-wise at the time. So it gets some points for modernizing a little bit to more kind of what people wanted in terms of like wireless charging, that sort of thing. But it didn't really blow people's socks off. The iPhone 10 is an interesting one. I actually don't know where I'm going to put this one. I think I'm going to put it in A tier. So the iPhone 10 was a big update, but it was... I never had one myself, but it was really obviously kind of in the way the original iPhone kind of set the stage for what design on the iPhone was going to look like for a decade. The iPhone 10 seems to be doing that as well. Like the iPhone 10, if just when you look at it from the front, looks very similar to the iPhone 13, 13 Pro that we have this year, and it's presumably going to look like phones for the next couple years as well. So definitely the first of an iconic look for the iPhone, but just not as high tier in my opinion as these other ones. You could maybe argue that it should be up in the S tier, but I think for me it's an A tier. Now, the next year we got rid of the bezeled phones. We all had iPhone 10 style screens, but Apple had to have a cheaper option. They couldn't sell because the iPhone 10 was $1,000, the 10s was $1,000. They needed something in the like $600 to $700 range as a starting price, and so that's where the 10R came in. It had LCD. It wasn't that great. It was really just filling a void in the market. I'm going to put this in C tier. It wasn't particularly good. It was kind of hard to recommend to people. It was the right iPhone for most people that year, I think, but just because it was cheaper. It wasn't particularly great, in my opinion. The 10S, I'm going to put in the... This is my list, I suppose. Yeah, I'll put it in the C tier as well. Almost put it in the D tier, specifically because the cameras actually were a downgrade, in my opinion, over the 10 and 8 that came before it. They just took weird pictures. The HDR was really impressive. It got tons of dynamic range. I think there was a Smart HDR update that year, or maybe that was the first Smart HDR. I don't remember exactly, but I do remember the photos I took with that camera were just not the best. So a degradation over what we had previously. So I guess what I'm saying is that year, not a great year for the iPhone, at least in terms of my personal scale. Now we're getting into really the modern era of phones. I think the iPhone 11, I'm going to give it I'll give it a B tier. I don't know if that necessarily makes total sense, but I do think for whatever reason, it was easier to tell people to buy the iPhone 11 than the 10R, even though they're very similar phones in many ways. I think the dual cameras helped. I just think that, I don't know, for whatever reason, I feel more generous towards the iPhone 11 than the 10R for some reason. Can't explain it, but we got to move on. So the 11 Pro, this one also may surprise you. I think it's an S tier. I think this is one of the great iPhones. I think they nailed so many things with it. It added a third camera, so we got the ultra wide lens. It added night mode for photography. It added incredible battery life, really great battery life on these. I think the design was great. I think it's the best designed version of the iPhone 10 style of body, even better than the 12 and 12 Pro, in my opinion. I really, really love this phone. It just is an absolute killer. My wife still has the 11 Pro, and it's just, every time I pick it up, I really, really like it. So that brings us to the iPhone SE2, which I'm going to put right here in the middle. I think it's okay. I think it's fine. I think it fills a need in the market for a smaller phone, but I don't think it's as exciting as the original SE was. I think the SE original was like, wow, this is so much better than we thought, and the iPhone SE2 was kind of like, yeah, this is what we thought it was going to be. And, you know, expectations ruin reality or whatever, but you know, I think it's a fine phone, just not the most exciting one on the list in the grand scheme of iPhones. So now we're into 2020 phones, the iPhone 12 and 12 Pro. The iPhone 12, I'm actually going to put up here. I just lost my keyboard, so I've been recording for 10 minutes, I think. I'm going to put the 12 in the A tier. I think the 12 is a really great phone. This was the year that the cheaper iPhone, the like $700 iPhone, suddenly was really no compromises. It had the OLED screen. There was the mini version as well if you wanted a small phone. I do think the battery life wasn't that great, but in terms of like, do you get the Pro or the non-Pro? For the past couple years, you really wanted the 11 Pro, you really wanted the 10S, but this year, I don't know. It was hard to recommend people, unless you really wanted the telephoto camera, it was hard to tell people to buy the 12 Pro that year. So the 12, really good. Which brings us to the 12 Pro. And I'm going to say it's a B tier phone. I think it's okay. A little disappointing, frankly, coming from the 11 Pro for me. The design looks really nice, but isn't as good in the hand, in my opinion. The cameras were effectively the same unless you had the 12 Pro Max, which I personally didn't, so maybe that holds me back a little bit. But yeah, battery life wasn't as good. The design wasn't quite as good. I really like the blue phone, so that's the 12 Pro that I had. Really like that color, but it just wasn't, it didn't blow my socks off like some of the other phones had. And now we're into 2021, the current iPhones, the 13 and the 13 Pro. And these are a little hard to judge right now because we're really close to it. They only came out a couple weeks ago as of recording this video. So I'm going to say the 13. Oh boy. I'm going to say the 13 is right around here. I think it's a minor improvement over the 12, and the 12 was an A tier. The B, or the 13, I think it's not enough better from last year to really make it notable. I think the 12 is more notable in my memory already than the 13 is. And the 12 got 5G as well, I guess, if that's a notable thing for you. And then the 13 Pro, I'm going to throw it up here. I think the 13 Pro is a really good device. Maybe not iconic necessarily, but the improved battery, the much better cameras, the upgraded cameras on all 3 back lenses, I think is really good. It's a really, really nice phone. That's actually what I'm filming this entire video on. Just decided to film one on the iPhone for fun. But yeah, I guess that is my list of the iPhones. Those are my tiers. So the S tiers, the original one, the 4, the 5S, and the 11 Pro. I mean, I think that's a pretty good list. I think those are really the phones where Apple just nailed it. Everything like from the vision of the original one to the incredible design of the 4 and 5S, and then the 12 or the 11 Pro that had great design and then great performance, great cameras, great battery, just great everything. I think those are really the 4 iPhones that stand out to me as the most impressive. On the other end of the spectrum, we've got the 6 and the 7 that just like, just didn't land with me, just were not my favorite iPhones. Those were just like, okay, I'll get it because it's the iPhone, but like, these were not the years that I was most excited about that device. So yeah, that's it. Feel free to disagree with me vehemently in the comments. If you have different phones that you think belong in the S tier, I'd really love to hear those, actually. This isn't meant to like bash on any iPhones necessarily. I just kind of wanted to think this out together. So I did not do this ahead of time, so I had no idea what the scores were going to be. But yeah, this is what I think of the iPhones. Let me know what iPhones you loved, which ones I underrated. I'd love to hear that in the comments. So thank you so much for watching. Bye-bye.